Welcome to your first flipped classroom lecture. Just as a reminder, please make sure that you take notes during this video so that you're prepared for tomorrow's class activities. Also make sure that you make note of any questions that you may have throughout the video. And finally, do not rush through the video. You are working at your own pace, so if you need to stop the video or rewind it, do so. If you need to watch the video more than once, you can also do that. Good luck! Before we officially begin, let's take a look at what you will have learned by the end of today's video. First, you will learn about the problems that the U.S. had when George Washington becomes president. Then you're going to learn about the key players in President Washington's cabinet, followed by Alexander Hamilton's plan to deal with the economic problems facing the U.S. Finally, you're going to learn about the first two political parties and the different points of views between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. So let's get started. The Constitution finally gets ratified, and the U.S. government now has to deal with a new set of problems. Some early American problems are listed here. The first problem is that the U.S. government had to deal with people remaining more loyal to their states than to their country in general. The second problem is that people were weary about the Constitution since the Articles of Confederation had failed. The people were still worried that Britain and France could potentially attack the new and fragile nation. And finally, the largest problem that the U.S. faced was that it was severely in debt. With all these problems facing the U.S., George Washington is inaugurated as the first president of the United States in 1789. John Adams is selected as the first vice president of the United States. Both Washington and Adams belong to the Federalist political party. New York City officially becomes the first capital of the United States, and George Washington takes the oath of office in front of Federal Hall in New York. George Washington's first task was to select his cabinet. Edmund Randolph of Virginia was named the Attorney General, the nation's chief law officer and legal advisor. Henry Knox became the Secretary of War. For the position of Secretary of State, Washington chose Thomas Jefferson, who would handle relations with foreign countries, and Alexander Hamilton accepted the job as the Secretary of the Treasury. Here is a picture of President Obama and his current cabinet, the secretaries of the 15 executive departments making up the executive branch. After becoming the Secretary of the Treasury Department, Alexander Hamilton's first task was to deal with the severe debt that the U.S. was in. The United States had two different types of debt, foreign and domestic. Both the foreign and domestic debt that the nation had dated back to the Revolutionary War. Spain and France, as well as the American citizens, wanted to be repaid. Citizens were beginning to lose faith that the government would ever repay them back. So Alexander Hamilton's plan was to restore the people's faith in the U.S. economy by doing the following: pay back all federal and state bonds, and take the national and state debt and combine it all into one huge national debt. Southerners such as James Madison, the father of the Constitution, hated this plan because the southern states did not want to be responsible for northern debt. So a compromise was reached. The South agreed to allow the federal government to take over the debts of the northern states, and the North agreed to move the capital to the South, Washington, D.C. Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist, the same as George Washington and John Adams, but the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, belonged to a different political party. He belonged to the Democratic Republicans. Even though they both belonged to George Washington's cabinet, they had very different views on government. Alexander Hamilton favored trade, manufacturing, and the development of cities. He believed that the federal government should have more power than the states, and he believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that the government could do anything that the Constitution does not say it cannot do. Hamilton was also pro-British and wanted to be allies with Great Britain. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson favored farmers and rural communities. He believed that the states should have more power than the federal government, and he believed in a more strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning that the government should not do anything that the Constitution does not specifically say it can do. Finally, Thomas Jefferson was pro-French, meaning he wanted to be allies with the country that had aided us during the Revolutionary War. With these differing views, two political parties emerged. The Federalist leader became Alexander Hamilton. They believed in a strong central government led by industry and the wealthy, with an emphasis on manufacturing and trade. Federalists also believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, favoring national banks and protective tariffs. They were also pro-British. On the other side, Thomas Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans. They believed in strong state governments led by the common man, with an emphasis on agriculture. They believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, opposed the national bank and protective tariffs, and were pro-French. So now you have a foundation for the new government after the ratification of the Constitution. The next video will explain in more depth Alexander Hamilton's banking system and tariffs. After watching the video, you should be able to answer the following 4 questions. What problems did the U.S. have after the ratification of the Constitution? What was Alexander Hamilton's plan to deal with the economy? What was the economic compromise? And what are the differences between Federalists and the Democratic Republicans? This concludes your first flipped classroom lecture. Remember to answer the history blog and write down any questions you may have on the material.